I'm Catherine Sheeran, host of the podcast Horse Tales with Cat. Today's guest hails originally from Port Hope, Ontario. Hyde Moffatt has been working as a rider and coach in the jumping industry for more than 25 years. He has a reputation for developing and training young horses to bring up through the ranks, as well as training young riders. In 2018, Hyde started riding a number of horses with Lothlorien Farms in Cheltenham. Based on his success in 2022 with his Mount Quinton, he was named to the Jumping National Team program for Canada. Hyde, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I always like to go back to what brought you to horses. And in researching you for the show, I saw that you had a very interesting start in riding from a very early age. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Well, I was born in Port Hope and grew up in Brantford. And the advantage of growing up in a smaller town is that some stuff happens sometimes that maybe doesn't happen in the larger centers. And I was at school one day, and for show and tell, a girl brought a horse to school, and we were all able to take a little hand walk around the schoolyard on the horse. And I came home from school that day, and I said to my parents that this was what I wanted to do. And we went through a fairly circuitous route. We maybe tried some soccer and some other things before we got back to horses, but I was hooked right from day one.
And from what I understand, you also went through the Pony Club, did you not?
Absolutely. I did start with Pony Club. It was wonderful that the woman that I took my first riding lessons with had been a longtime member of the Hamilton Hunt Pony Club. And we were very privileged that a lot of the administrators of that club, being volunteers who had also passed all the way through the Pony Club levels, all the way up to both the riding A level and the horsemanship A level. So the quality of the education that was accessible to us at that club was really quite good.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I spoke with Beth Underhill last year, and she also went up through the Pony Club and talked about it gave her so many opportunities that she otherwise would not have had. I just think that that's interesting that you also went that route. And then, from what I understand, you started riding and breaking racehorses at 14. Am I correct in that? How did that come about?
Well, I've never had what some people would call a real job. I've always been privileged enough to work in barns and muck stalls and do things like that. And it was a passion. It wasn't something that I even considered to be work, but I was mucking stalls one day to earn money to pay board on the horse that I had at the time. And the gentleman who had been leasing the back half of the barn had a business breaking and starting and legging up racehorses. And he came in the barn one day and asked if I would know anybody who was capable of getting on the 2-year-olds. And I said, sure, I'll do it. And at the time, he wasn't quite aware that I was 14, and I never thought to mention it. And that's how I got my start doing the racehorses. And he was a wonderful horseman. I'm not sure if he'd ever ridden a horse himself, but he was very good at starting horses, at teaching them to long line and to lunge and getting them safe and having that as a real priority in how the horses were developed, that they were developed in a way that was good for the horses, but also safe for everybody involved.
So I would imagine that really shaped your approach with young horses, having that kind of a background.
Most definitely. It provided me the opportunity to sit on a lot of horses. And I don't know that you can replace that kind of experience with any kind of lesson or anything like that. It allowed me the opportunity to sit on so many and to have to listen to the horses and listen to what their body language, what their reactions are telling you, and then to understand those reactions and the things that may accompany those reactions. And certainly the lessons that I learned in doing that are, I feel, some of the skills that allow me to remain employed in this industry.
So maybe talk a little bit about that because I feel like you are a little bit of a unicorn in how you have approached the business. You're not doing the traditional barn full of clients and having to go from show to show. I know that you have a tremendous reputation as a clinician. You do a lot of training at barns with small groups, but maybe share how that came about. How did you decide to go down that road?
I'd say it came about very organically in that I broke all the racehorses for a number of years. And through that was asked to break and start some young horses for some show barns. And that went well enough that I was asked to do some of the more difficult horses and try and make some progress there. And so one thing sort of led to another, and it was really an organic thing. But one of the reasons that my business has developed maybe in a slightly different route than others is that I rode what was available for me to be ridden. I wanted the experience. I also needed to be employed. So I was a catch rider for a number of different professionals, and I always filled whatever role was necessary. As a result, I got the opportunity to ride a lot of horses in the ring. And I guess what that translates to is actually a lot of practice as well. As things went on, I've certainly been asked, and it's a real privilege to be asked to help share some of the things that I've been able to learn along the way. And that's where the clinics and things came about. But I also tried to watch and learn a little bit from others within the industry, what they enjoyed about their businesses and their lives and the sport. And you try to figure out what's going to make you happy. And then you build something that hopefully allows you to do that.
And so, who were some of the professionals that you rode with? Because I was curious, I wasn't actually that knowledgeable about who you had trained with. It seemed to me that you'd done a lot of self training, to be honest.
Yes, definitely. I was lucky to have been a working student many, many years ago for Scott and Ann McKay at Greenhaven Stables in Burlington back when I was quite young again. I did that in the summer between the racehorses, which I did the rest of the year. From there, I moved on. I rode horses for many local farms. I rode for Jane Castleman. She had a fairly large sales operation. And then through that, I was asked to, geez, I've even lost order of the chronology, but I was fortunate enough to ride for Kingridge Stables for some years when I was younger. And then through associations there, ended up doing some work for Torchy Miller and Marnie von Schallberg and Mark Hayes for a number of years. And sort of one thing leads to another. And it always was about trying to do the best job you can. And that's the interesting thing about this sport is I love the sport. I love the horses. I love sort of all the different parts of it, but really the job's always the same. The job is try and take something, whether it's a horse or a person or another horse and their person, and try and make them a little bit better than they were the day before. And that's really what the job is, whether you're doing it at home at the farm or you're doing it at the five-star show. And I've been privileged enough to do both of those things.
So it is interesting to me because I know you first, if I'm not mistaken, entered the Grand Prix ring in 2004. And that horse was Ting Tin. And was that your own horse or was that owned by somebody else?
No, that horse was a wonderful horse owned by a gentleman named Angus McKee. And he was a lovely man who has sponsored Mark Hayes and myself as a result of that. And Ting Tin was a wonderful horse that was actually originally purchased for Melissa Brown when she was riding there, and I had been helping do some of the younger horses, helping do some of the more difficult ones. Melissa had gone off to the World Championships that year, and I came in and filled the role, rode that one, and then I believe through a series of unfortunate events, she got injured, and that's when I really sort of took over in that capacity and riding him. And he was a wonderful horse. He was a little tougher to ride, but it was quality animal that gave me a real foothold in some of the bigger stuff. I jumped my first CSIOs with that one, and he really did give me a good leg up on things.
So I guess one of the challenges that you face as many Canadian riders is finding those mounts to go into the Grand Prix ring with. Particularly in your case, I admire the fact that not only do you have a very strong work ethic, you yourself have not been in a position financially to buy your own Grand Prix mount. So you've had to just sort of chip away at the opportunities that are out there. How do you face that mentally and emotionally on a day-to-day level? Like, you have a great attitude about, obviously you love doing what you do, but how do you reconcile getting to the next ride?
Well, I think you make the best of what you've got, and then hopefully through hard work, good things happen. And I've had some fairly good luck over the years turning horses that maybe didn't seem like they might be able to reach that level into horses that maybe can reach that level. And so sometimes they may not have all the talent, but your job is to take something and make it a little bit better than it was before. And if you keep doing that, sometimes they reach levels that you didn't really anticipate that they would in the first place. And at the end of the day, it's lovely to ride the Grand Prix, and I really enjoy that end of the sport. Certainly I'd like to be the best that I can be, but we can only ask the horses to do what the horses can actually do. And when presented with one that's very good, hopefully I'm able to do the job and take it all the way to whatever its potential will allow it to achieve.
So, how did it come about that you started riding some of the horses for Lothlorien Farm? That happened back in 2018. And I guess I don't know, are you still riding horses for them?
No, I'm no longer riding horses for them. I did it for 5 years, I guess, or 4.5 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. Although I'd also ridden some horses. Lothlorien currently is Ariel Grange, and I had actually previously ridden some young horses for Sue when Sue was Lothlorien many years ago, and that was quite a interesting time. I was quite young at the time. I believe Chris Pratt was the rider,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
the head rider for the operation, and I came in and rode a number of young horses. That was back in the day when, probably around the time I had Tington. I can't remember the exact dates, but it would have been around then. So it was, call it round two, but it really wasn't, because it was a whole different group of people and different everything. But when I came back the second time, they approached me about riding some horses one winter while they were down in Florida. And then when they came back from Florida, they had talked about going on a European tour, and they asked if I would show the horses that had been left behind. To be honest, initially I turned down the opportunity because I had a barn full of horses that I had brought along and spent a lot of time developing, and I was hesitant to take the job because you always want to do a really good job, but there's only so much one can do in a day. So I had some reservation about taking the job, but eventually we came to a way of figuring out that, hey, this is probably going to work for everybody, and it was an amazing opportunity to have to have horses of that level again, and to be able to go and see some of the better venues in the world. And certainly the opportunity to walk into classes in Wellington, in Washington, in Tryon, in Spruce Meadows. You go to some of those bigger venues, you ride against people who are at the top of the sport worldwide, and it does nothing but help bring you up. You really do become better when you ride against people who are really good.
And I know you had tremendous success back in 2022 with Quinton. And based on that, you were named to the national jumping team squad. How does all of that work? I've never really fully understood. There's a B squad, there's an A squad, you're named with a horse. So now that you're not riding that horse, does that mean you no longer get to be part of the squad? If you could enlighten all of our listeners with that.
Well, to be honest, it's one of those things I've never paid too much attention to. A lot of those results tend to come when you go out and do a good job consistently, then you tend to be rewarded with that. I believe that the A and B squads are both based now on data. Essentially, it's on percentages of clean rounds at various different levels, allows you to be named to certain squads, but it really has never been a priority of mine to try and get those things done. It's more show up every day, do a good job. And that's sort of one of the added bonuses, I guess, of having performed at a level consistently.
Okay. And I guess really my confusion was more over, I thought that when you got named to one of these squads, that there was some financial repercussions for you as a rider. But are there, or am I wrong about that?
There is a carding system at the top level,
Okay.
and I have previously been carded many years ago, but so many now that I having trouble remembering the details. But I believe the carding system has changed over the years, so I wish I had more information, but I'm certainly not an expert.
That's fine. It was just more a curiosity because these things do seem to change around a lot. And I'm never really clear on what it means for you as a rider. Does it give you a better opportunity in terms of approaching owners because you've got some sort of backing from the federation? But I'm gathering not.
There is some tax advantages, I believe, in terms of horses that represent the country may have some benefits, but again, as I don't ever own them myself, I don't often reap those benefits, so I'm a little bit underinformed.
So I wanted to touch base on a couple of things that you talked about earlier. One is your tremendous work ethic. I did wonder, where does that come from? Would you say that that's just something in you or that was instilled in you by your parents? I was just curious what has shaped you to be such a hard worker.
I think it's a bit of an innate quality. I think my parents are both very hard workers as well. And I just don't think that anything happens for free. You know, you sort of reap what you sow. And I don't know that I'd ever really want to be idle. I enjoy working. I enjoy the feeling of accomplishing something. It doesn't really feel like work, to be perfectly honest. I like what I do. And, you know, whether that's riding and training a young one, whether that's showing it, you know, some of the biggest shows around, or teaching someone, really feel like eh, I owe it to myself, to the horse, to the sport, to try and do the best job that I can when I do something.
And at what point did you make this a full-time career? Because I know, you, as you said, you started really breaking horses at 14. At what point did you turn from school and say, okay, that's been great, but this is what I'm going to do?
Well, I think I wanted to be a vet when I
Oh,
was a young person. And my last year of high school, I had some of the local vets would call on a reasonably regular basis, and they'd pick me up from school, and we'd go off to a call, and I'd ride a horse so that they could explain what I was doing while I was riding it, because sometimes horses present as unsound, but when ridden a little more forward and a little more through, they tend to be able to work themselves much sounder. And that was what was happening a fair bit. And at the same time, I was breaking the racehorses and showing a very little bit as well. And it just sort of developed from there. I was done at school, and people called and asked if I would ride more horses. And it was never really the plan. In fact, growing up in Brantford, I don't think that that was ever something that I really envisioned, was that this could be a career, because I'd had zero exposure to that lifestyle, or anyone really that did it as a true professional, where this is how they were making their living. But things really happened organically.
yeah, I was going to say, when you use the word organically, that really does sum this up, because I don't think I know anybody that has gone your route. And even in terms of how fun would that have been to have the vets calling you, and even they would think of using you to put you on the horse to test out what they thought was potentially wrong with it. But also, I just think you didn't do the traditional, I was in a barn with a trainer and I went from A to F in so many years. You really just have forged your own path. I think that just speaks volumes to you as an individual, just in terms of not only work ethic, but just your malleability, that you've been able to kind of switch directions and kind of find your way. Who would you say inspires you as a rider?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there's so much to be learned from everyone. You know, as a kid, I grew up idolizing Ian Miller, and you know, of course, he was Captain Canada. I remember getting his autograph at the Royal when I was 6 or 7 years old, and it's those memories stick with you as sort of the first person that you really looked up to. But there's so many people. I mean, I've had the opportunity to work and learn a little bit with Jerome Dubaldam over the years through the association with Lothlorien, and there's a guy who is as good as anyone in the world at identifying talent, developing that talent, knowing when to press forward and when to provide education and when to win. And that's a really interesting person to be able to observe, and the ability to work with top class vets. You know, there are also people that are so important in what we do, and same thing with the top class farriers. And you watch guys like Nick Skelton ride. I had the privilege of riding a little for Tim Grubb over the years,
Hmm.
and you see all these different styles, and yet they're all producing good results. So there's just so many things to learn in this sport. I think maybe that's what keeps me interested too, is that there's always something else to learn. And it's almost like the older you get and the more you do this, the more you realize you don't know. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure I'd be well suited to a job where I had to come in and do exactly the same thing every day. And while it may seem that that's exactly what I do, it really isn't. The horses there's always something else to learn from them. And I think that's why I stay interested.
I think you touched on something even just in your approach, because I feel like sometimes people get married to sort of a system, and it sounds like you're more about the horse than using the exact same approach every time you set foot on a new property. And I think that is really important because, not all horses are created equally. And I'm remembering that that was something that I think everybody liked about Eric Lamaze, was that he felt like he would adjust his ride to the horse. And so it sounds like that's your approach. And I think that is really important, because so many times we think it has to be a certain path every time in order to get those results.
Well, because of the pathway that I've taken, it's not that I've been able to go out and purchase horses that are the style I like. A lot of the time, I'm hired to ride a horse for someone because they're struggling with it or whatever the case may be. So, in some ways, that might be an advantage to me in that I didn't get the luxury of saying, well, these are the things that I like and this is the way I want them to go. It was more try and figure this horse out and see how you can get it to go well. So, I do believe that it's necessary to adapt. Certainly, it's more important that the horse knows what we want and is able to do something in a way that is conducive to its way of going, that's easy for it, that makes it want to do it more, instead of us demanding that they go the way we feel they should go because this is what we like. At the end of the day, I'm not the one jumping the jump. So I think it's important that they're the ones who dictate how we go about it. And certainly the short coupled thicker horse is probably going to want to do things differently than the long lanky one. I think being able to figure that out and put those pieces into the way we approach each horse is probably a really important part of it.
I would imagine that makes you a very good clinician. I myself had the privilege of attending one of your clinics about 2 years ago with my horse, and he was new to that particular barn and was having some real challenges that day. And I would say what I admired about you was that you were very calm and quiet and changed the exercise depending on how the horses were all responding. So that brings me to, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I did not realize that you were the chef to keep for the Young Riders team back in 2014. And you may have done it other years as well. I just know that particular year they were in Kentucky. So I was thinking that these gifts of yours from learning would be really helpful in that kind of situation. So how did that come about, that you were, I mean, because that's a pretty big deal being the chef to keep for the Young Riders team.
It was quite a privilege, and I was asked to do it one year. I think I filled in the first year at a last minute, and I'm quite comfortable in those sort of on the ground, trying to make all the pieces work scenarios. I don't mind a little bit of pressure, and it also catered to maybe a little bit my ADD, because you've got a lot of different balls in the air when you're doing that job, and trying to make sure that everybody knows the rules and gets the most out of the performance and knows where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be there. So it was another quite interesting experience for me, and I've had a good relationship with Equine Canada over the years as well. I think so. It was nice that they trusted me to go and help those kids have that experience, because that is a really challenging environment. Most of the time, it's the most difficult thing that those kids have ever seen. Maybe also the most difficult thing that their mounts have seen at the time. So, and also the first time they've had the opportunity to ride in a team environment, which brings different pressures itself. So, it was nice to be able to go and do it. And certainly the teaching that I've done in the past and has allowed me the opportunity to see many different riders in many different states of stress, not just the horses, but certainly the riders. And you learn to identify certain cues and behaviors that are stress associated. So, and maybe also how to deal with those things when they're happening. So, a lot of times when you see someone getting maybe a little bit overwhelmed, if you have strategies to deal with that and be able to focus their attention in ways that might be a little more productive in that moment, you can help get them through those moments. And certainly we had a number of moments over the years. I was privileged enough to do it for quite a few years as chef de keep, and we had a number of moments where things didn't go the way we wanted to, and there's an opportunity for those negative events to spiral and become worse. But if you can redirect and refocus, you can certainly achieve great results, and some of those worked out very, very well.
Well, that's a good lead into my next question, which was going to be, how do you deal with the day-to-day stress when you're at a competition? Because I've had this conversation with quite a few riders recently, because it's more common today for people to be working with sports psychologists than back when I started in the sport. I was wondering, what's your approach to dealing with the stress?
It may be overly simplistic, but I believe that if you practice and you believe in your skills, and if you believe that you can control the outcome because you have proficiency with your skills, then there's not really a lot to worry about. Because one of the first times that I jumped as a member of the Canadian team, like a CSIO down in Wellington, I was about to walk in. It was with Tington many years ago, about to walk in the ring, and somebody said to me, "Well, aren't you nervous?" And I said, "No, not really." And they said, "Well, why not? This is the biggest, most important class you've ever jumped." And I said, "Well, I'm either going to go in there and it's going to go well, in which case that was what we were aiming for, or I'm going to go in there and it's going to go poorly and I'm going to have to go home and practice, or I'm going to go in there and the horse won't go, in which case I'm going to have to practice a lot." But really, those were the only three outcomes. I trust my position and my skills to keep me on the horse, and I try to use those skills to guide us to the best possible outcome. And if it doesn't go well, well, then I know that I need to go home and work on something and get better.
In terms of then representing the team, did you feel like there was an extra pressure when you were riding for Canada versus riding as an individual?
I think that really all you can do is the best job you can do on that day. I don't know that putting more pressure on yourself than that is anything that I don't feel like I'd benefit from that, but I certainly always strive to do the best job that I can do. And that's really all I can ask.
Fair enough. Tell me a little bit about the horses you're developing right now. Are these horses all owned by investors where you're riding for them, or are some of these young horses your own? Maybe walk me through a little bit of that.
At the moment, I have one horse that I acquired along the way who is a little bit of he was underdeveloped maybe as a young horse, and looks like there's some good potential there. We'll see what this coming season brings. He certainly has great talent. He certainly has nice reflexes, and hopefully I can provide him with the education that allows him to excel. I have a number of other horses that are all young at this point. They're not quite ready to walk into the FEI classes at the moment, but certainly with an eye towards developing them to that level. Some nicely bred young horses, a nice 6-year-old that won the series this year and has, every time she goes to the ring, she sort of learns something new and steps up. So I'm excited. I hope that she becomes a really good horse one day. And certainly I'm always on the lookout for the next horse. And I don't always have, as we had spoken about, I don't always have the money myself. I occasionally have some investors, but you never know. Good things can happen as well. I happened to acquire quite a good Grand Prix horse a number of years ago that paid his way. He was a good winner, a horse called Grand Churro. And sometimes it doesn't take a lot of money. It just takes a lot of hard work.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And so what would you say is your favorite thing about what you do day to day?
I think just trying to learn something new every day. And sometimes that's even around the farm. I mean, you learn a lot of things when you run a farm. Who knew that one day you'd be doing plumbing and the next day you'd be doing hay? But yeah, that's kind of the way that farming works. But I think it's the idea that you can learn something every day. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be really boring if we just always sat around and rested on our laurels and thought that this is the end and I can't progress. I think every time I sit on one, I'm trying to think about, how can I do this just a little bit better? Or what might I do that might allow this horse to understand what I'm saying better? And that challenge is what keeps me going.
So just the basic communication, which is interesting because I did speak with an animal communicator about 2 months ago, and it was fascinating to me to hear what she had to say in terms of what makes horses tick. And so often we forget about that aspect of the sport because they can't speak to us, but they do. So interesting that you mentioned the communication side. I was also curious to see what you feel is the biggest challenge Canadian riders face right now in the sport.
Oh, another great question. I think that the sport in general has become so, at the top level of the sport, has become so worldwide. The travel, I think as Canadians, we're always going to have to be a little bit of a hard scrabble group. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but some of the challenges in the sport sort of mimic the challenges that we have as a country. I mean, to set up a telecommunications network that goes all the way across this country is difficult. So having horse shows all the way across this country is difficult, or where we're going to be able to all get together and compete directly against one another. We're always going to have to travel. We're always going to have to find a way to make it happen. Where if you're immersed in the center of the universe in Europe, maybe that's an easier thing to overcome. But I'm a believer that the things that don't kill you make you stronger, and the ability to rise above the challenges is sort of what might define us as a group as Canadians. And certainly, if you look at Beijing with the silver medal, when Max Horse was hurt and we had to compete with three horses in the final round, and we jumped off for gold. And for me,
Mm-hmm.
that was a real turning point as a rider, where there'd been many years I was not around when we medaled in Mexico. I wasn't around for when Michelle went silver in Montreal individually, but that moment of, wow, we're really jumping off for gold. Like, we've done it, and we've done it down a man. This is something that is so Canadian to me. I mean, we had to fight for it. We had to make it happen. I mean, really, do we want it to be easy?
No.
That's what you get out of it's that overcoming adversity.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with you. I still remember watching the 2008 Olympics and being so proud as a Canadian and as a rider. And like, you shared that enthusiasm, like, can't believe that we're here doing this. And then just going on to individually for Eric, I mean, I just think that's a really big deal. And
Hmm.
sometimes we forget about that as Canadians. So,
Absolutely. And I might add that, like, it's not that I or any of my peers thought that we weren't good enough to do it, but it's that it hadn't been done.
exactly.
It's we kind of knew that sure we could do it, but boy, Germany's good, and the US has so many more owners and horses, and there's all these things that are always sort of riding around in the back of your head, and then all of a sudden it is done. And that sort of opens your mind to the possibilities of what could come.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, it's you see somebody do it and you realize, okay, it's possible. They've set the groundwork up for the rest of us to feel like we can also achieve. And I would agree with you, because I feel like a lot of times we look to the US, where there's just such a depth to the financial support that they have. And so they could produce four teams that are ready for the Olympics. I think you're right that that's why we always compare ourselves to those countries. And so then you feel like, okay, it's not really achievable. But at the end of the day, to see that it is makes a difference. Well, I'm really touched by just your enthusiasm and your optimism. You don't see your kind of optimism every day. And I really think it's quite inspirational. So does that also just, is that something that was instilled in you? Or do you feel like, have you gone through the journey of self-help books, or just that's something that you kind of grew up just feeling very optimistic about things in general?
I think it's just me. I think that horses, they make us full of hope. I think that if we weren't optimistic about trying to develop that 4-year-old, it probably will never get to the Olympics. So we always have to have that outlook. We have to treat them like we want them to be good, if they're ever going to achieve that. I think being optimistic is a required point of view if you want to excel within this sport. But also, I'm an optimist because this sport has been very good to me. I am very privileged to be able to go in and do a job that I don't even really consider to be a job every day. And that the number of people that I went to school with, some good friends all the way through high school, who had ambitions of playing in the NHL or in the NBA, they all wanted to do a sport and be able to do that professionally. And this sort of happened accidentally to me, and I get to do a sport for a living. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what lies ahead in the next year or two? Are there any goals that you're dreaming about that kind of come to mind that you'd like to check off that box?
I'd like to produce the next horse. That's really it. I'd like to find more horses for sure. And I'm always trying to find the next one that has good quality, but to be able to then produce it and bring it up to the next level. And if I'm lucky, that next level will be in horses to jump again at the 5-star level. And if not, all I can do is the best that give them the best opportunity to jump whatever it is that they tell me they want to jump.
And is there a venue that you dream of that you haven't been able to compete at yet?
Ooh, watching Aachen and Geneva this year certainly made those two venues certainly high on the list. But really, the even the Canadian tour, we're really lucky to have some of the venues we've got. Spruce Meadows truly is one of the best places in the world. Thunderbird is such a good place to show, and it's certainly more difficult to get there. But I own a truck and trailer, so you never know.
Well, listen, I really appreciate your taking time out to meet with me today. And I really wish you all the best in the future and just keep that optimism going. And I hope to see you back in the 5 stars with the mount that you've produced soon.
Thank you. I hope to be there as well.
If you'd like to learn more about upcoming podcasts or guests, please follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Horsetails with Kat.